Easy questions.
Thank you. Oh, like an ice cream cone. My favorite food group, yes. So, John, thank you for the invitation to be here. You're doing a great job as the president this year of AQUA, talking about being in the middle of water, being the chair of the Association of California Water Agencies. Must be a really enlightening experience for you, right? But you're doing a great job. I always welcome the opportunity to remind us all how connected we truly are as Californians from our fields to the urban centers. Because if we're all lucky, we get to eat 3 times a day. Although unfortunately, there are many in our own population that don't have that opportunity. But we live in the #1 agricultural state. I know that gets bandied around a lot, but it's a pretty remarkable thing that we're able to do in the country's most populous state as well. Certainly, if you talk about climate change, this year's drought brings it home in a very painful way. And there have been a number of actions that have been taken since the first of the year. It's interesting to note that at the time that the governor made his disaster proclamation and emergency proclamation in January, we were at that time on track to have a historical drought. I'm glad to say that since that declaration, we have had some precipitation events, so this will only be on record as the 3rd worst drought in our history. But the bottom line is that we will have less water to grow less crops, and it will have an impact on jobs and some impact on exports. Last week, in the midst of having made all the allocation decisions that we're required to make about the allocations of surface water, the Department of Water Resources also released a groundwater report that showed we are depleting our groundwater basins, which is not unexpected considering that we're in our 3rd year of a drought. Groundwater is that bank account to help us get through bad years. But every year that we have cutbacks on surface water allocations, we must depend on that groundwater basin again and again and again. And we need surface water to be able to recharge our groundwater basins. So the complications of solving that wonderful, complex issue of California water are just beginning, and I honestly think this is the year that we're going to see some action on that. One of the things that I have to put into context is that until the crop is harvested, we really can't give you specifics of what the exact impact is. But we know by looking at the 2009 drought, there were 285,000 acres fallowed. That means there weren't people in the fields planting and harvesting. There was less product going into the processing plants. There were less jobs available for truckers. And 2009 was the only year in the last 10 years that we actually had a slight decrease in agricultural exports. We know at that time it was about $340 million of economic revenue that was lost and 9,800 jobs. Based on that 2009 study, which was the first of its kind trying to really quantify the socioeconomic impact of a drought, we have commissioned the University of California, Davis and expect a preliminary report from them next week to give us preliminary numbers of what we might expect to see. Some farm organizations have estimated that we could have anywhere from 500,000 to 800,000 acres that will be fallowed this year. And if it is that high, there's no doubt that there will be consequences for agricultural exports, as well as the availability of all those favorite California commodities that we enjoy in our farmers markets. But I was asked to come to talk about something that I think is a very positive and exciting element of California agriculture, in addition to the flourishing farmers market community and the emphasis on our local regional food systems, and that is exports. Exports from our fields to hungry customers around the world. One thing I want to leave everyone with, California agriculture is open for business. And we want to stress that message because we have become such a consistent supplier to the global food chain that people are asking questions about that. They forget that in farming, we deal with cycles of nature on a routine basis, and drought happens. What we need to do is be prepared and make sure our system is resilient as possible. So on to some pretty impressive numbers. Last year, nearly $18.2 billion worth of agricultural crops went into the export market. And a lot of that, because it came out of the Central Valley and from wine country, of course, went through the Port of Oakland. That represents 13% of the nation's total agricultural exports, which are really growing rapidly. And when you think about some of those basic commodities out of other parts of the country, the fact that our high-value, nutritious horticultural crops, our dairy, and our beef sector was a contributor to that is pretty impressive. We now export California agriculture to 167 countries, everything from China to Canada to Mexico to West Africa and the country of Liberia. Over the last 10 years, our exports have actually increased threefold from $6.5 billion in 2002 to over $18 billion in 2012. That's a pretty impressive record. During this period, we've experienced 6 consecutive years of export growth from 2002 to 2008, 6 years of double-digit growth, and only 1 year, 2009, the last severe drought year that we've had. That's 9 years of export growth. California produces over 400 commodities, and we track through the UC Ag Issues Center the top 60 exports of those. It's no secret that since 1998, almonds have been the leading agricultural export from this state. And in fact, California supplies over 80% of all the almonds in the world. That was the year, 1998, that almonds actually surpassed cotton. So almond acreage has done this, cotton acreage has done that. Today, almonds represent about 18% of all California agricultural exports. And in fact, the tree nut sector, almonds, walnuts, and pistachios, 3 crops that we do uniquely here and have strategic advantages here and have documented nutrition elements that make them popular as a food of choice around the world. Those 3 have been in our top 5 agricultural exports. But 3 of those represent 30% of our exports. But tree nuts are only part of the picture. We're also the largest dairy producing state. And what's fascinating about the dairy sector is we tend to think of milk, butter, yogurt, ice cream. Those are not exactly the products to go into the export market. Technology has allowed us to break down the components of milk to very high-value byproducts that are used in a whole array of food manufacturing and a very efficient way of delivering nutrition and low-fat protein to the consumers. Exports of California dairy products have exceeded $1 billion. In fact, California dairy products to China in 2012 increased by 54%. I've seen California organic milk, that is one exception to the fresh product, Strauss Family Farms organic milk, and a Singapore organic market at over $20 for a half gallon of milk. When people want a product that enough, and they're fortunate enough to have that kind of discretionary income, that's what they look for. Wine is another success story, and if anybody knows me, they know I got to be lucky enough to spend a part of my career in the wine sector. California is the world's 4th largest wine producer, and wine is our 3rd largest export product. Just like dairy, its exports have exceeded $1 billion. In fact, last year, 10 of our crops exceeded $1 billion in worth. Those exports represent a lot of mainstream brand names that you and I both recognize as our favorite everyday table wine, but there's huge demand in fast-growing middle-income countries like China and the Middle East for those high-quality brands, very unique products that go for unbelievable prices in high-end grocery stores. California's share of U.S. wine exports is 94%. Does it sound like I'm bragging? Because I am. You know, I'm a farm girl from Nebraska. I think it's pretty cool what we can do here in California. Another one of our leading exports is table grapes, another one of those healthy, fresh products that we're so proud of. It was our 6th largest agricultural export last year with a value of $810 million. Over the last 10 years, table grapes have increased more than twofold, and have experienced 8 years of double-digit growth. On average, it's been 8% in that period of time. And California represents 100% of all table grapes that are exported from the United States. If we counted only our top 10 crops, California would be the 5th largest exporter, but because we get to count all of our crops, we're the number 1 exporter. $1 billion in U.S. farm exports stimulates $1 of U.S. exports stimulates $1.31 in economic value. So that means we're contributing about $23 billion to the local economy of California with agricultural exports. We estimate that our agricultural exports account for 141,000 jobs. They're in the valley, on the farm, they're in the processing plant, they're in the labs, they're in the marketing offices, most of them in the Bay Area, they're at the ports, they're on the highway carrying those products back and forth. Our leading export partners are Canada, the EU, China, and Japan. And we see Asian markets as where the 21st century holds the greatest promise for us. That's where our strategic advantages, being on the West Coast with the infrastructure that we have, is going to make the difference of what we're able to do as long as we keep growing it. Today, we have a population in the world of 7 billion people that will grow to 9 billion people by the year 2050. What's remarkable about that fast-growing population is that it's also in countries where they're having fast growth in their middle income. When we think about a country like China, 300 million people account for what they use for their middle income sector, which is about the population of the whole United States. 95% of the world's customers are outside of the borders of the United States. When a family has $1 more of discretionary income, they want to feed their family better. And what they want to feed their families are the healthy foods that we grow in California. Fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, low-fat proteins from our dairy and our beef sector. So we have tremendous opportunities to continue to grow. Our advantages also come from the changes that are happening in those countries that are eager to have our products. They're shifting away from the traditional wet markets to larger grocery markets and convenience markets. They're choosing to go out more to enjoy restaurant foods, where the food service sector has fast growth in those countries and wants reliable suppliers of high-quality products with a commitment to environmental stewardship and food safety. And they want more diversity of food. They don't want to just have that bowl of a grain with some scraps of protein. They want to improve their lifestyle and feed their families better. It's interesting to note that the governor took a trade mission to China last year, and there's been a lot of benefits from that, including the opening of an office there. This summer, he has announced that he will be taking us to Mexico. Mexico is a critically important partner for all the reasons that we can imagine. For agriculture, it represents 27% of our dairy export market, 26% of our fruit market, 42% of our cut flowers and nursery products, and just to throw in a little tidbit, 38% of the fig market. So now we know where all the figs are going when they're not in your local farmer's market. So shifting to how do we ensure the world that California agriculture and the state of California will continue to be that preferred and reliable supplier to the global food chain. Two things that this governor is leading the efforts on. One is that before this drought, Secretary Laird from Resources, Secretary Rodriguez from Cal EPA, and myself put together a California Water Action Plan. It's not the complete package of solutions to our long-term water problems, but it outlined actions that we could take over the next 5 years to improve our resiliency. And a theme in that, before we knew that we were going to have the drought situation that we had, is resiliency to drought. It includes actions like better watershed stewardship, thinking about how our forests are connected to the water that we enjoy on the valley floor. It took a very serious look and recommended that we need to improve our groundwater management to not just focus on when we extract water, but deliberate ways of increasing storage in groundwater when we have those wet years and the ability to move surface water around. It stresses conservation. There is so much that we as Californians can do to be world leaders, because we're not right now on water conservation. We've done it on energy conservation. We have to create a culture of water conservation in California. We have enjoyed this era of abundance and this notion that we don't have to be careful with every drop. But regardless of where we live, we can all make a positive difference with water conservation. We really want to embrace the technologies that have allowed us to better use recycled water. When I think about the opportunities to connect urban and rural California by treating wastewater and using that for irrigation on the farm, in addition to the landscaping that we enjoy and know is important for attracting our tourists here, recycling water is really a no-brainer. A few weeks ago, the State Water Board released $800 million at 1% interest for shovel-ready recharge projects and recycling projects. That's an important thing. The plan also stresses the importance of storage and really focusing on regional scale storage projects, which have been more successful at gaining the support of voters in recent years because they can see how that benefits them. And being able to cite more small-scale storage projects within a region will improve the resiliency of that region. The other effort, and the governor never shies away from the opportunity to talk about climate change, is all of the work that we're doing across cabinet to really take a look at mitigating climate change and making sure that we have strategies in place for climate change adaptation. Number one in that Safeguarding California report, fascinating reading, I highly commend it, is being better prepared for drought and improving our resiliency to drought. In closing, I want to emphasize again that California agriculture is open for business. Drought happens. With a changing climate, it's probably going to happen more often, and we can and must be better prepared. There are many actions that we can take as individuals, but the most important thing that we can do as Californians is know that we're in this together. It's not about one part of the state or another. It's not about urban versus rural. We're all in this together, and we all have an opportunity to contribute to the long-term success and prosperity of California. It is a time to invest in our infrastructure. What we have coasted on for the last decade is what visionaries created for us more than 50 years ago. And many of them took the hard votes and made the big investments knowing that they as individuals would not enjoy the tangible benefits of that infrastructure. And our infrastructure needs to be upgraded to make sure that California is poised for the kind of exciting contributions to the world that it's made in its past. As the governor says, California is a home of inventors and dreamers and innovators. And it's our turn to step to the plate to make sure we've got the infrastructure and the atmosphere to continue that wonderful history. Thank you very much. And John, I'm happy to take questions.
If you have completed a blue card, if you can raise it up and then the questions will be brought up to me. We have some volunteers that can pick up the questions. While those are being done, clearly Governor Brown scored a grand slam with his appointment as Secretary Ross. Thank you very, very much. Are there any questions that we have coming from the audience? Yes, we do. Thank you.
Just the easy ones.
Okay. Water infrastructure, desalinization. Can we do it to supplement?
That's a great question, and over the last few months, I have not once spoken without that very question. So when we think about one of the things that makes California so unique, it's our 700 miles of coastline. And it seems like we would have more desalinization going on than we do, and the major barrier has been economics. cost of water, availability of water, how much energy it takes to make desalination work because of the saltiness of the ocean water that we're treating. So it's been economics. However, we've had a successful, very small plant in Marina in Monterey County that's really helped fill the gap. Santa Barbara had one that they decommissioned. And San Diego, because of the cost of water that their friends at Metropolitan are passing on to them, have made the investment. They felt that over the next 30 or 40 years, it made sense for them to start a project, go through the permitting process with our California Coastal Commission to make that happen, and that I think will be online 2015 or 2016. Yeah, 2016. And that's going to be larger scale. And I think the economics of water, the cost of water, how we see the value that water brings to us will probably have some pricing changes that will start to make that more viable. We definitely support it. I also think we're at a time with the drought and the understanding of the food, health, water nexus to global food security that we will see new technologies rush to this area. And I'm very excited about the opportunities for mobile desal units running on solar that are being used in the Central Valley now as a pilot to treat really salinity-heavy water in the Central Valley. So I think we do have tremendous opportunities.
Thank you. And that's a good cue. On September 5th, we're holding our third Water Energy Nexus Summit at the PG&E Auditorium. We're hoping to have both Governor Brown and Senator Feinstein at it, and we'll be talking about water and efficiency. This next question also feeds right into what you're talking about in terms of innovation for technology for irrigation.
Thank you. We have about 50% of the farmed acreage is under micro drip and micro sprinkler technology, which is state of the art. A lot of our farmers use very sophisticated weather stations, evapotranspiration modeling, and soil sensors, but not enough farmers have had access to those tools, especially smaller farmers. Part of the drought emergency legislation that passed in February provided $10 million to the department from cap and trade dollars to really invest in on-farm irrigation technology, water use efficiency that would also lower greenhouse gas emissions. We have a lot of models out there. We know that will be very popular because the president made $25 million available earlier this year for that kind of technology. They had over 2,000 applications for actually over $50 million worth of projects. So we know, I won't say there's a thirst for that kind of technology, but there clearly is an appetite to accelerate our investment in that, and we do a lot of work promoting those uses. Actually, yeah, I kind of ad-libbed a little bit, but I can get statistics to you. Happy to.
Okay. Next question.
Regarding ag export infrastructure, are you concerned about the longshore and other unions as it relates to reliability, strikes, work slowdowns, decreased efficiency? Certainly, those impact, the local economy. I'm not a labor expert, but I know that we oftentimes suffer shortages of trucks, and right now in some parts of the country, shortages of rail cars for lots of different reasons, which we view on the farm as out of our control, so we'll keep producing what we produce and leave it up to people at the next pay scale to get that. Can I dodge that question any better?
You did a really good job kicking that down the road. This also reminds me, we'll try and get Secretary's remarks as we can for our website as well. All the PowerPoints will be on our website next week. So if you're taking notes, they'll be available next week. And this is being videotaped, so as soon as we have that, that'll be made available as well. This question is, how can you have an effective conservation program when so many users in California are not metered?
Okay, so first I have to do an embarrassing disclaimer. My hometown is Sacramento, and only half of Sacramento has a meter. Maybe that will be accelerated if my friends at Aqua will help us out on that, because it's embarrassing for me to stand up and know that my farmers are fallowing acres and we don't have meters. So I think that meters are one part of measuring to better manage. However, there is new technology available. What matters is that we're measuring it and monitoring it, and meters are what we know today, but they may, if we commit to that, it may lock us out of making use of new technologies, especially with regard to satellite and GIS imaging and the opportunities that we have to get the same kind of data that's necessary to be better managers.
Thank you. Now we're getting into some more controversial questions.
Okay, those are yours, John.
And those are mine, not really. Okay, I'm trying to read this. Real impacts over the next 4 years of the California severe drought conditions currently are projected. Projects proposed that can be completed to increase capacity. That's not too controversial.
No, that's a really important one. I think the area of conservation combined with much more use of recycled water for irrigation purposes, wastewater treatment, stormwater capture, and taking advantage of every opportunity where there is flood water or additional surface water for groundwater storage. When we think of storage, it's not just above ground storage that's part of the answer to this. And those were the kinds of projects that we're working to get identified so that we can get some funding out there to make it happen.
This one will get me in trouble with my friends in Northern California. What can we learn from Southern California in water conservation?
That is so legitimate, and I oftentimes have to tell my farm friends that you can't just talk about LA and its swimming pools and its lawns, because LA, going back to the drought of the 90s, said never again, and they made significant financial investment. Incentives for home and business water conservation, incentives for recycling, incentives for cleaning up groundwater basin to be able to use that water, and significant funding in regional scale storage projects. Their per capita use, I think, is about 150 gallons per capita compared to Sacramento at about 280 gallons per capita. LA has shown us what it takes, and they've also chastised us, especially Orange County, that you're way too soft on this conservation message. You have to be in people's faces about everything that they can do to be a part of the solution.
Okay, now I'm going to defend Northern California real quick on this. Actually, LA does use less per capita than we use in Northern California per household, which most people don't realize. And they've also spent $18 billion over the last 2 decades of their own ratepayer money to build this, as has in our area where we are at East Bay Mud. We spent over $1 billion the last decade. That's why we're at 10% voluntary, not 35% mandatory.
I need to remember your numbers too.
Okay, I'll get them to you. Okay, now that we're facing a drought in California, what are the plans to use a flood when the flood happens in order to be better prepared for the next drought?
And someone reminded me the other day that every drought ends with a flood. So don't ignore flood planning, and certainly the California Flood, the Central Valley Flood Commission has a number of projects, and what we need to be smarter about is looking at projects that provide multiple benefits. We historically have gone into large-scale infrastructure with thinking about this, like our stormwater regulations were written about preventing pollution and not thinking about capturing stormwater as a beneficial use. So the Flood Commission is very integrated into many of the conversations we're having about water, because I don't want to flood, but I do want to flood, and so we have to be prepared and be smart about how we plan those projects.
This is related to both water and exports. As California exports more, we also need to import more. Is this sustainable in respect to water resources?
It's a really good question, and I will just throw out some statistics. I'm a liberal arts person. I was an English major, and I tend to look at these kinds of issues from the humanitarian point of view, but there's also a business angle. As I said, 95% of the world's customers do not live on our borders. We know that there are hungry people where there's not the capacity to grow enough to feed those people, that we have opened the gates to commerce on a global basis decades ago, and that's not going to go back into that. What matters is that we are the best stewards we can be with every resource that we do use, and that we're also taking that technology to help others farm better and do their own stewardship, and that is very possible. At the end of the day, when you look at the need to more than double food production to meet the needs of 9 billion people by the year 2050, it's estimated that food production on a global basis has to increase more than 50%. Some people say 100%. So we have to use technology. We have to adapt every way that we possibly can so that we are meeting the needs of those people. Because quite frankly, we have already seen that high prices of food or the inability to access food creates civil unrest. And so food security and water security are top issues at the UN and many of the topics that they address. Okay, please address the twin tunnels. That's for Secretary Laird. Okay. Clearly, that is a part the governor has not shied away from stating his position on fixing the delta and doing it in a way. The proposal has been modified significantly. The administration is still on track to have that BDCP plan approved by the end of the year. If you haven't read those 30,000 pages of comments, I'm sure you did. On the environmental impact report, this is about fixing the delta as part of the state's infrastructure and doing it in a way that preserves farming and the quality of life in the delta, protecting areas of origin that supply the water that goes through that delta, and meeting the needs of the 2/3 of the population that lives south of the delta. So I think the governor's pretty clear on his position. Last two. Yeah. Does our water resource
infrastructure keep up with our growth?
I would say, based on the fast growth that we've experienced in the last decade in particular, no, our water infrastructure has not kept up with this. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is controversial, and we love to have good fights in California about something complex like water. Two is that when we built the infrastructure that we did with the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project in particular as examples, we didn't account for environmental impact of those projects. And it's taken court cases and implementation of laws that have really absorbed some of the water that was previously available for urban and agricultural use, so that we're now accounting for, of the applied water in the state, 41% goes to agricultural uses, 42% goes to environmental uses. That's water that previously was part of how we were divvying it up, and we must preserve our environment. We know that's critical to resiliency with climate change. The last question is, what are the prospects for vertical urban farming? I love this question. I am so excited about the opportunities for urban farming and very small-scale micro farming along the edge of urban centers. I think the best thing that's happened to agriculture ever is this renewed interest in food, where my food comes from, how it's produced, who's producing it, and connecting what we eat is the best way to avoid chronic diseases that cost us a lot at the end of our life and our economic sector. So I think that we are at the beginning of some really innovative urban farming projects that absolutely can and should happen in California, not just in the Great Central Valley or the Monterey Peninsula. New York City's got some really exciting stuff going on. Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, San Francisco certainly is doing some creative stuff. You can call it community gardens, but there are real opportunities for new people who are interested in farming, young people who have a passion for farming, to do very small scale, couple of acres, connecting with chefs, with a community-supported ag subscription, with farmers markets, have a good living, and make sure that there's access for all of our citizens, regardless of where they live, to healthy California-grown food. Thank you so much for letting me end on such a positive, exciting note.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Ross. That was great. Again, we will have everything online for you to see. We're going to take a 15-minute break. Please check out our sponsors tables and our new members table. We'll begin at 10 o'clock. And again, if you have questions for Eric Saperstein on WERDA, he's right back there. So thank you.